highest civilian honor, the Defense Medal for Distinguished Service. Professor Allison's latest book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Precipitous Trap, is a national and international bestseller. Over a career in the academy and government, and as an advisor to key policymakers, Professor Allison has played a consequential role in shaping public policy and government. Now let's welcome Professor Allison.
So let me thank you very much, especially the student organizers. It makes faculty members here and the whole dean very proud to see what students can do. And I especially appreciate your bringing together so many people to try to talk candidly to each other, not be shouting and demonstrating, about difficult issues. And I thank the ambassador for coming to Harvard. We welcome you back, as we were discussing yesterday, and we had dinner the other night, for a lively discussion. I thought his speech was excellent, lots to agree with, and many points to disagree with. So that's also good. And we'll have a chance in the discussion to try to see where we agree and where we disagree. Because the main idea here, and I think this is your main idea, is that we live in very turbulent times. Actually, in reality, the swells or the size of the waves has changed quite dramatically and is likely, in my view, to get worse. But there's also a lot of froth on top of the waves that confuses us. So, for example, walking in today, if I look at the slogans, China seeks world domination. I would say false. Okay? China seeks a new Cold War. False. Okay? I could go down a long list of things that are wrong, that I believe are incorrect. But I would also, if I ask myself to the litany as part of the Chinese talking points, China has never engaged in any military action against anybody during the period since the founding of the Chinese communist regime. I think if you ask the Vietnamese or Indians, Russians, they might have a quite different view. That'll be a good topic for debate and discussion as the things go forward. So I think having a very candid discussion about where there are real disagreements and where there are actually confusion because either we're not communicating clearly, or maybe we have contrary views. And especially when we have contrary views, I learn more from people who tell me things that I don't agree with than when they tell me things I do agree with. So I think, again, congratulations to the organizers of this conference for getting together for candid conversation as we go forward. I just come back from 9 whirlwind days in China, where I was very graciously received, let's see here, by almost all of the leadership of China. And I couldn't quite understand why they were being so kind and generous, because people gave, I would go to a meeting that was scheduled for an hour, and 2 hours later, the conversation would be going on. I told the ambassador, the last day I was there, I went to see Li Shulei, who's the head of the propaganda department for the government. And I was scheduled to be there for an hour in order to make my flight to come back to Boston. And hour passes, 2 hours pass. I'm noticing I'm never going to make my flight. 3 hours passes. So I had to end up changing flights to go back at night. I made my life somewhat unhappy, but in any case, I was thrilled to have somebody so engaged in a conversation. So I think the extent to which the Chinese government under Xi Jinping is now reaching out to people for serious conversations about which there's agreements and disagreements is very healthy. So let me underline 3 points here briefly. I'd say first, the good news. Second, the bad news. And thirdly, a question mark. And to telegraph where I'm going, the good news is that President Xi and Biden at San Francisco, at their summit last November, actually not only put a floor under what was a rapidly deteriorating relationship, but laid a foundation on which the US and China are now constructively building. And I'll say something more about that in a second. The bad news is that Xi is Xi, China is China, the US is the US, and these two nations are destined to be the fiercest Thucydidean rivalry rivals history has ever seen. This, I think, is baked into the cards, structurally. And the third proposition is a question mark. And since I'm an optimist, I interpret question marks as positive signs rather than negative signs. But the question mark is whether the leadership and societies in China and the US will find a way to live in a world in which they will be simultaneously fierce competitors and at the same time thick partners, which I think is the only way they'll survive in the environment that we live in the 21st century. Let me say a word about each of these. First, the good news. So it's not no surprise for anybody that the relationship between the US and China, as the ambassador said, has been deteriorating over some period of time. And that, in part because of reality, and I would say very substantially because of the froth of misperceptions. So that's why it's so important for events like this to have people talking very candidly to each other, saying where they disagree, figuring out whether the disagreement is for real or whether it's because of some confusion, either in the translation for those of us that are like myself who speak only one language. So unfortunately I don't speak Mandarin. But there's also, all of us see things through our own eyes, and therefore we tend to be suspicious of somebody else when the eggs are missing. I like the example. I had heard of it before. And it mostly turns out that the eggs were not taken by your neighbor. They mostly misplaced, or your son or daughter ate them, or some other thing happened. So distinguishing between where there's an understanding and where there's a misunderstanding, I think is a very important part of what's going on here. But in any case, what happened in San Francisco? The two leaders not simply put a floor under a rapidly deteriorating relationship. They each embraced their own version of what they call San Francisco consensus or spirit. And this was very clear to me. I knew the Washington side of this story very well because I'm entangled with the Washington team fairly thickly, since it involves many people that are part of the many former students, colleagues, and others from here. But I was impressed that Xi Jinping, Wang Yi, and all the other folks I had an opportunity to talk to in the system have embraced themselves their view of a San Francisco consensus, which is almost identical to the Biden view that the Biden team believes, which is this will be a relationship based on three pillars, three fundamental elements: competition, communication, and cooperation. So competition, for sure, American and Chinese athletes going to the Paris Olympics are each seeking not a win-win solution, unless participation is winning, which in some sense it is, but each seeking to bring home as many gold medals as they can, and as many medals as they can. And if I'm running in the marathon race with the ambassador, one of us will be first and one of us will be second. And that actually is a healthy thing. Each of us will run faster if we're running against each other. So China's advances in green technologies has been as a competitor with American and other international efforts to build green technologies, and it's run faster than it would have run otherwise. So the competition, I think, is an inevitable piece of this, and will be fierce. Secondly, communication, and this was the most important part, I think, of the San Francisco consensus. The two leaders must talk regularly, candidly, privately to each other about the most delicate and dangerous issues. And the signs of success in a diplomatic relationship of this sort is that what they talk about, even the agenda, or all the details of the agenda, are not known publicly because they want to be able to talk privately. And the same things they don't want to have to discuss publicly. So secret candid discussions between leaders is a foundation. On that you build then relationships and communication between trusted agents, so that's Wang Yi and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. And Tony will actually be out in China again this week. On that you build in communication between the people that work for them. So Janet Yellen was there talking to her counterparts 2 weeks ago. As I say, Secretary of State will be there next week. Gina Raimondo has been there talking to her colleague. And what do? They talk about where do we agree, where do we disagree, how can we resolve differences. That's called successful diplomacy, but it requires thick, continuous communication. Third, there's cooperation. So how many areas in which the U.S. and China require cooperation, each for their own well-being? Start making the list. It's a very long list. So can you compete and cooperate and communicate all at the same time? Well, that gets us to our question mark. But in any case, what happened in San Francisco was not just a floor stopping a deterioration, but a foundation on which clearly the Chinese government, and I can tell you from the people I know in Washington, the Washington government, are committed to building over the period ahead. I came back, therefore, much more optimistic, at least about the year ahead. That's the first point. Second point, the bad news. Xi is Xi, President Xi is President Xi. China is China. The U.S. is the U.S. What does that mean? If you read my book on Destined for War, you'll have the basic idea. Okay? Contrary to discussion in Washington or even chatter around Harvard about Xi Jinping being nervous or anxious or concerned about his position, I would say this man is confident, cool, collected. As Steve Schwartzman said after, who was one of the people at the participation, said, if this man is uncomfortable in his skin, he deserves an Academy Award. So he welcomed people very, let me see. This you can see. He welcomed this group of businessmen, plus they brought me on as a waiter, which I'm not quite sure why, but he was actually as interested in talking geopolitics as he was about the economic and business issues. But for sure, Xi Jinping is the person whom I describe in Destined for War in my profile, which is the profile that essentially tries to channel Lee Kuan Yew, who was the person who I think understood, the international person who understood Xi Jinping best. Xi Jinping is extremely ambitious. He's extremely determined. And as I wrote, I think is likely to be the most consequential leader on the international stage today. And what is he seeking? As he says it very clearly, to make China great again. That was his slogan before President Trump got there. He calls it the great rejuvenation of the great Chinese people. Now, what does that mean? It means he's intending to make China everything it could be. So as Ambassador rightly said, why should Chinese have only a quarter or a fifth of the per capita GDP of Americans? They're pretty smart. They're pretty hardworking. How about half the GDP of Americans? Well, then they would have a GDP twice the size of the U.S. We just do the arithmetic. Well, what if they were 3/4 as productive? Yikes. They would have a GDP 3 times the U.S. We're going to have a defense budget 3 times the U.S. Intelligence budget 3 times the U.S. Xi Jinping actually in the conversation said at one point that Obama had explained to him that if Chinese became as rich as Americans and behaved the way Americans did, the biosphere would become uninhabitable because we emit so many greenhouse gases. So his view of that, Xi Jinping's, is what we're going to do with the Chinese way, the Chinese version of modernization. And could anybody explain to a leader of China, or indeed to you as Chinese students at the school, why China should be happy to be a quarter as productive as Americans, or half? I don't think so. I couldn't if I were Chinese. So, is the U.S. determined to be the U.S.? I think so. Do Americans believe, including me, that the 8 decades of peace without great power war that we're unofficially living in today, a historically unprecedented long peace, as John Gaddis has written about it, is a fantastic accomplishment for America and the world? We do. And do we believe that a big part of that has been American leadership in shaping the international security order? We do. And do we think that includes the order in Asia? We do. Does that include the alliance system with Japan, and South Korea, and Australia? Yes. Does it mean that the Navy, the U.S. Navy, is the predominant power in the waters, including the peripheral waters of China? Well, it has been. Is that going to change rapidly? I don't think so. So, we have a rising China, inevitably rising, and a U.S. in which, at least in the grand narrative, is irrevocably declining. Well, actually, this is a seesaw. And it is the case that if one becomes heavier, the seesaw shifts. So I would say this is baked into the proposition of geopolitics. And that's the story of a Thucydidean rivalry, and that's the story that we've seen historically ultimately leads to a war. So that's the bad news. Now, the question mark. Can leaders in China and the U.S. be intelligent enough to find a way to escape Thucydides' trap? This is one me who, again, I've met him several times before, but I was very surprised the extent to which both he and all the other people working with him are actively now engaged in the search for the question how to escape Thucydides' trap. That was the topic they wanted to talk about repeatedly. And here's Xi Jinping with the senators in October, in which, among other things, he made this statement talking to Senator Schumer and his delegation, I am in you and you are in me. And this brought them up short, since this is not a statement that Americans are familiar with. Indeed, as I said to the ambassador when we had dinner the other night, 2 of the senators called me up when they came back and said, Graham, what the hell is going on? What is he talking about? Okay? And I said, unfortunately, I don't know. Let me go see if I can discover something in Chinese history or culture or philosophy. It turns out that actually in the Qing dynasty, our colleague Mark Elliott is very familiar with, this was a version of a saying that is more common, but I was ignorant, so I didn't know. Certainly the senators didn't know. What is this about? This is about, I think, his perception, which I believe is absolutely correct, that if we ask about the world of the 21st century in which we are now trying to survive, both China and the US, there are reasons why my survival requires cooperation with you. And your survival requires cooperation with me. Well, survival is a pretty powerful motivation. Indeed, if I fail to survive as a state, I don't really get a chance to do anything else. So why am I in you and you in me? First, we each have nuclear arsenals that are so robust that if we really had a war, and it really was a full-scale war, at the end of the war, both China and the US would have been erased from the map. So it would be no China, no USA. Oh my God, that's a catastrophe. Ronald Reagan taught us a nuclear war cannot be won, because at the end of the war you've lost your whole country. So must therefore never be fought. That's a big therefore. Must therefore never be fought. So you have to change your behavior and persuade your competitor to change his behavior to make sure you don't fight other people. Well, climate. We now know we live in an enclosed biosphere. Either China or US emissions could make it so disruptive that neither of us could live in it. So do we have to find a way to cooperate in constraining grid? Yes. Financial system. The financial system is now so integrated that when we had a Wall Street caused financial crisis in the US that led to a great recession, we would have had a global depression had it not been for a joint Chinese-American coordinated stimulus. So again, I'm in you and you in me. The analogy that I use for it is the notion it's almost like we're conjoined, inseparable conjoined Siamese twins. So however outrageous I am, however unreasonable, however much I'm deserving to be strangled, if you give in to the temptation and strangle me, you will be committing suicide. No, that's not a good idea. Okay? So could leaders in Beijing and Washington find a way to get their minds around this challenge that really does involve contradictions? And I believe the answer is yes. I think maybe, let me see if I can go. Sorry, I have another slide, but I didn't put it up here. I've been searching in Chinese history and Chinese philosophy for examples, because Chinese history and philosophy is more complex and nuanced than Western traditions. So the idea of rivalry partners, which is a way that historians have characterized the Sun and the Liao, with the Chang'an Treaty in 1005, or the story that Sun Tzu tells about Wu and Yue, the two guys in the boat that are required to row together to get to the shore, or even yin and yang. The idea of contradictions that then somehow together create a whole that produces a harmony is a Chinese idea, not an American idea. But I think it's a very interesting idea that Americans can learn from. So what I was doing there was both listening and talking about such examples. And I think it's very promising that the Chinese leadership at the very top is struggling with this, with this as a conceptual challenge. And I think for those of us in university, this is a great topic. It's a great topic for Americans and Chinese to be talking about, because we're at a time when I think both in Washington and in Beijing, people are looking. Henry Kissinger, my old professor, talked at length with Xi Jinping about this when he was there last August. And when Henry came back, he gave me an account of what in the conversation, and he said, this man is seriously looking for a strategic concept, that's what Kissinger called it, that will combine both fierce competition and thick cooperation. And that's the challenge. So I would say for those of you at the conference, that's a challenge. Nobody, that's all. There's a lot of clues in this space, but nobody's written that as clearly as they should. And I hope that over the course of the conference, you maybe can make some progress in it. So thank you for letting me